The sun was setting over the suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. Officer Patricia, Pat Monroe, sat in her patrol car, sipping from a lukewarm cup of coffee as she scanned the quiet streets. It was one of those slow evenings where nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just another routine shift for the veteran cop known for her no-nonsense attitude and sharp eye for detail. As Pat turned onto Maple Lane, something caught her attention. A sleek black luxury sedan glided past her at what appeared to be just under the speed limit. The car looked expensive, too expensive, she thought, and it stood out like a sore thumb in this sleepy part of town. Pat frowned slightly, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her. Why would someone driving such an extravagant vehicle be cruising through this modest neighborhood? Curiosity quickly turned into suspicion. She flipped on her flashing lights and pulled the car over near a cul-de-sac lined with family homes. As she approached the driver's side window, her hand rested instinctively on her utility belt. The tinted glass rolled down slowly, revealing a well-dressed man behind the wheel. He wore a crisp suit, his tie perfectly knotted, and his expression calm but puzzled. "Good evening, officer," he said politely, his voice steady. "Is there a problem?" Pat studied him closely, taking note of his clean-shaven face and confident demeanor. Everything about him seemed polished, almost too perfect, but instead of putting her at ease, it only heightened her unease. "License and registration, please," she replied curtly, her tone clipped. The man nodded without hesitation, reaching into the glove compartment to retrieve the documents. His movements were deliberate and unhurried, but Pat couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't adding up. When he handed her the papers, she took them cautiously, her eyes flicking between the license photo and the man sitting before her. "Marcus Johnson?" she read aloud, raising an eyebrow. "What brings you to this area tonight, Mr. Johnson?" Marcus smiled faintly, clearly trying to remain composed despite the tension thickening in the air. "I'm visiting a friend who lives nearby," he explained. "We had dinner plans, but I must have taken a wrong turn." Pat crossed her arms, narrowing her gaze. "A wrong turn?" she echoed skeptically. "This is a residential street, not exactly a shortcut to anywhere." "I realize that now," Marcus said evenly, maintaining his composure. "Like I said, I got lost. No harm done, right?" But Pat wasn't convinced. To her, his explanation sounded rehearsed, his calmness suspicious. She glanced back at the car, noting its spotless interior and high-end features. Her mind raced with assumptions. He didn't belong here, not in this neighborhood. People like him, she thought, didn't usually venture into places like this, unless they had ulterior motives. "You seem pretty relaxed for someone who claims to be lost," Pat remarked sharply, stepping closer to the car. "Mind if I ask what you do for a living, Mr. Johnson?" Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "I work in corporate management," he said simply. "I oversee operations at my company." Pat smirked, though there was little humor in it. "Corporate management, huh? Must be nice." Her tone dripped with sarcasm, and Marcus stiffened ever so slightly, sensing the shift in her demeanor. She leaned down further, resting her forearms on the edge of the open window. "You know, we've been getting reports lately about outsiders coming into neighborhoods like this, folks who don't live here causing trouble, breaking into homes, stealing cars, you name it. So forgive me if I don't take your word at face value." Marcus blinked, visibly surprised by her accusation. "Officer, I assure you, I'm not here to cause any trouble. I already told you, I'm visiting a friend. If you'd like, I can give you their address so you can verify." Pat straightened up, shaking her head dismissively. "Don't bother. I'll decide what's true and what's not." She tapped the license and registration against her palm, her frustration mounting. Something about this man rubbed her the wrong way, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Maybe it was the way he spoke, so measured and controlled. Or maybe it was the fact that he drove a car worth more than most people made in a year while claiming to be lost in a middle-class suburb. Her suspicions hardened into certainty. This wasn't just some innocent mix-up. There had to be more to the story. and she was determined to get to the bottom of it. "Step out of the vehicle, Mr. Johnson," she ordered firmly, her hand hovering near her holster. Marcus blinked again, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Why? I haven't done anything wrong." "That's for me to decide," Pat shot back, her patience wearing thin. "Now step out of the car, or do I need to make this more difficult than it has to be?" For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension between them crackled like static electricity, heavy and unrelenting. Then, with a resigned sigh, Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. He stepped out slowly, keeping his hands visible as he locked eyes with Pat. "What's this about?" he asked again, his voice tinged with frustration now. "I cooperated fully. I gave you my information. What more do you want from me?" Pat ignored his questions, focusing instead on the growing anger simmering inside her. In her mind, she had already painted a picture of who this man was. A wealthy outsider who thought he was above the rules, strutting around in his fancy car like he owned the place. She refused to let him off the hook, convinced that beneath his polished exterior lay something sinister. Little did she know her assumptions were about to lead her down a path she never could have anticipated. The cool evening air did little to ease the tension crackling between Officer Pat Monroe and Marcus Johnson. Standing beside his sleek black sedan, Marcus kept his hands slightly raised, his expression a mix of confusion and frustration. Pat circled him slowly, her boots crunching against the gravel on the side of the road. Her eyes darted over him as if searching for some hidden clue that would confirm her suspicions. "You're acting awfully nervous for someone who claims to be innocent," Pat said sharply, breaking the silence. "Why is that?" Marcus exhaled deeply, trying to keep his voice steady. "Officer, I'm not nervous. I'm just trying to understand what's happening here. You pulled me over for no reason, accused me of being suspicious, and now you're treating me like a criminal. I haven't done anything wrong." Pat stopped in front of him, crossing her arms. "That's for me to decide," she snapped back. "And let me tell you, Mr. Johnson, your attitude isn't helping matters." Marcus blinked, taken aback by her hostility. He had dealt with difficult situations before, tense boardroom meetings, high-stakes negotiations, but this felt different. This wasn't just professional conflict, it was personal. The way she looked at him, the tone of her voice, even the subtle shift in her body language, it all pointed to something deeper than a routine traffic stop. "Look," Marcus tried again, his voice firmer this time. "I've cooperated fully. I showed you my license and registration. I answered your questions. What more do you want from me?" Pat didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, invading his personal space. Her gaze locked onto his, challenging him to say something else. For a moment, Marcus thought about backing away, but he stood his ground. He refused to let her intimidation tactics break him. "You know," Pat began, her voice low and biting, "people like you always think they're above the law. Driving around, in your fancy car, flashing your money, thinking you can do whatever you want. But let me make one thing clear, you're not special. Not here." Marcus frowned, his jaw tightening. "People like me?" he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What does that mean exactly? Are we talking about people who drive nice cars or people who happen to be successful? Or are you referring to something else entirely?" Pat ignored his question, brushing past him to glance into the car again. She shone her flashlight inside, inspecting every inch of the interior. The leather seats gleamed under the beam of light, and the dashboard sparkled as though it had been freshly cleaned. Everything about the vehicle screamed wealth and privilege. Things Pat seemed to despise more with each passing second. Satisfied that there was nothing incriminating inside the car, she turned her attention back to Marcus. "Let's try this again," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Where were you coming from before you ended up here?" Marcus hesitated, unsure how much detail to share. "I told you, I was heading to see a friend. We planned to have dinner. Together." "And where does this friend live?" Pat pressed, circling him once more. "I don't remember the exact address," Marcus admitted, his patience wearing thin. "But it's somewhere nearby. Like I said earlier, I must have taken a wrong turn." Pat scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes. A wrong turn? Into a residential neighborhood? That's convenient. It's the truth, Marcus exclaimed, raising his voice slightly. Why won't you believe me? Because I've heard stories like yours before, Pat shot back, her temper flaring. We get guys like you all the time, rich, entitled, thinking they can talk their way out of anything. Well, guess what? It doesn't work on me. Marcus stared at her, stunned by the venom in her words. He opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Pat made her move. Without warning, she grabbed his arm and shoved him roughly against the hood of the car. The metal was cold and unforgiving beneath his chest, and the sudden force of her actions left him breathless. Hey, Marcus shouted, struggling against her grip. What are you doing? This is ridiculous. Stay still, Pat barked, pressing harder to keep him pinned down. You're resisting arrest, Mr. Johnson. Don't make this worse for yourself. I'm not resisting, Marcus protested, his voice strained. You're the one attacking me for no reason. Pat ignored him, fumbling for her handcuffs. Her movements were quick and aggressive, fueled by anger and frustration. As she secured the cuffs around his wrists, Marcus winced, feeling the sharp bite of the metal against his skin. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. How had a simple traffic stop spiraled so far out of control? By now, a small crowd had begun to gather. Neighbors peered out of their windows or stepped cautiously onto their porches, drawn by the commotion. A few brave souls ventured closer, pulling out their phones to record the scene. The flash of camera lights and the hum of whispered conversations only added to the chaos. One man called out, "Is everything okay, officer? Do you need backup?" Pat glanced over her shoulder, her expression hardening. "Everything's under control," she replied curtly. "This individual is being detained for suspicious behavior." Suspicious behavior? Marcus echoed incredulously, twisting his head to look at her. What behavior? All I did was drive through a neighborhood. Pat tightened her grip on his arm, yanking him upright. "Save it for the station," she muttered, dragging him toward the patrol car. As she opened the back door and pushed him inside, Marcus caught sight of the growing audience. Some faces showed concern while others wore expressions of shock or disbelief. He locked eyes with a young woman holding her phone steady, filming the entire ordeal. For a brief moment their gazes met, and he saw something in her eyes. Sympathy, maybe, or outrage. Whatever it was, it gave him a flicker of hope. Once Marcus was securely in the car, Pat slammed the door shut and walked around to the driver's seat. She slid behind the wheel, gripping it tightly as she took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She knew she had crossed a line, but she convinced herself it was justified. After all, she was just doing her job, keeping the community safe. But as she started the engine and pulled away from the curb, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something about this situation wasn't right. The pieces didn't quite fit together, and the more she replayed the events in her mind, the more doubts crept in. Still, she pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on getting Marcus to the station and sorting everything out there. For Marcus, the ride to the precinct was long and uncomfortable. His mind raced with questions. Would anyone believe his side of the story? How could he prove his innocence when the odds seemed stacked against him? And most importantly, why had this happened in the first place? As the patrol car sped through the quiet streets, neither of them realized how profoundly this encounter would change their lives. What started as a routine traffic stop had escalated into something far more complicated, and the fallout was only beginning. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Marcus sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room at the police station. His hands were still cuffed, though they had been loosened slightly after he complained about the discomfort. The metal chair beneath him felt hard and unyielding, matching the stiffness in his posture. Despite the chaos of the evening, he kept his composure, refusing to let frustration get the better of him. But inside, a storm was brewing. Anger, confusion, and disbelief swirled together, leaving him restless. Across the table, Officer Pat Monroe leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She had removed her hat, revealing tightly pulled back hair that emphasized the sharpness of her features. Her eyes darted occasionally toward Marcus, but for the most part, She avoided direct eye contact. The tension between them was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. "So," Pat began, finally breaking the silence. "You ready to explain yourself now?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but laced with sarcasm. "Explain what exactly? How I got lost on my way to dinner? Or how you decided to arrest me for no reason?" Pat's jaw tightened, but she didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she reached for the folder in front of her, flipping it open to reveal a copy of Marcus's driver's license and registration. "Let's start with this," she said, tapping the papers. "Your address says you live downtown, in one of those high-rise condos, no less. Care to tell me why someone like you would be driving around Maple Lane?" Marcus sighed, leaning forward slightly. "I already told you. I was visiting a friend. I don't see why that's so hard to believe." "Because people like you don't just visit friends in neighborhoods like that," Pat shot back, her tone sharp. "They have chauffeurs or take Ubers. They don't drive themselves unless they're up to something." "People like me?" Marcus repeated, his voice rising slightly. "What does that even mean? Are we talking about successful professionals? Or are you referring to something else entirely?" Pat hesitated for a fraction of a second, but quickly masked it with a dismissive wave of her. "And don't play dumb, Mr. Johnson, you know exactly what I'm talking about." Marcus shook his head, incredulous. "No, I really don't. And frankly, I'm tired of being treated like some kind of criminal because of assumptions you've made about me. If you want answers, fine. Call the person I was supposed to meet tonight. Verify my story. It's not rocket science." Pat narrowed her eyes, studying him carefully. There was something about his demeanor, his calm confidence, his refusal to back down, that unsettled her. Most people in his position would have crumbled under the pressure by now. But Marcus seemed unfazed. It only fueled her growing unease. After a long pause, she stood abruptly, grabbing the folder and heading for the door. "Stay here," she muttered over her shoulder before stepping out into the hallway. Outside the interrogation room, Pat leaned against the wall, rubbing her temples. This whole situation was spiraling out of control, and she knew it. Her instincts had told her Marcus was hiding something, but now she wasn't so sure. Still, pride and fear of looking incompetent kept her from admitting she might have been wrong. Her sergeant approached, concern etched across his face. "Monroe, what's going on here? I just got a call from dispatch saying there's video footage of the traffic stop floating online. People are starting to ask questions." Pat groaned inwardly, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "It's nothing serious," she lied. "Just a routine detention. Guy got mouthy, resisted arrest, it happens." The sergeant frowned, clearly unconvinced. "That's not what I'm hearing. Witnesses say you escalated things unnecessarily. Look, Pat, I need you to clean this up before it becomes a bigger issue. Do whatever it takes to verify his story and make sure we're covered." Pat nodded stiffly, though her stomach churned with anxiety. As much as she hated to admit it, she needed to double-check Marcus's alibi. Reluctantly, she returned to the interrogation room and slid the folder across the table. "All right. Give me the name and number of this friend you claim you were meeting." Marcus stared at her for a moment, debating whether to cooperate further. Finally, he relented, rattling off the details of his planned dinner companion. A colleague named Sarah who worked at the same company. Pat scribbled down the information and left the room again, dialing the number with a sense of dread. To her surprise, Sarah answered immediately. After explaining the situation, Pat asked if Marcus had indeed planned to visit her that evening. Sarah confirmed the story without hesitation, adding that they had rescheduled due to a last-minute work emergency. By the time Pat hung up, her face was flushed with embarrassment. Everything Marcus had said checked out. But the humiliation didn't end there. When Pat returned to the interrogation room, she found her superior waiting for her alongside Marcus. The sergeant wasted no time, getting to the point. "Mr. Johnson has requested to speak with someone higher up regarding this matter. Given the circumstances, I think it's best we oblige." Pat bristled, opening her mouth to protest, but the sergeant silenced her with a stern look. "In the meantime, I suggest you review your conduct during this incident. We'll discuss next steps once we've spoken with Mr. Johnson. As the sergeant escorted Marcus out of the room, Pat sank into her chair, her mind racing. What had started as a straightforward traffic stop had turned into a public relations nightmare, and she was right at the center of it. Later that night, Marcus found himself seated in the office of Captain Reynolds, the precinct's commanding officer. The captain was a tall, imposing figure with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened intently as Marcus recounted the events of the evening, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad. When Marcus finished speaking, Captain Reynolds leaned forward, his expression grave. "Mr. Johnson, I want to assure you that we take matters like this very seriously. While I can't undo what happened tonight, I promise you that appropriate action will be taken." Marcus nodded, though his gaze remained steady. "Thank you for hearing me out, Captain. However, I'd like to clarify something. My concern isn't just about what happened to me. It's about the broader implications. This isn't the first time someone has been targeted unfairly because of biases within the system. If nothing changes, it won't be the last." The captain sighed heavily, nodding in agreement. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Johnson, and trust me, we're working on addressing these issues. But in the meantime, is there anything specific you'd like us to do?" Marcus hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Actually, yes. Your department recently entered into a partnership with my company to improve community policing initiatives. As COO, I'll be overseeing that project moving forward. I'd like to use this opportunity to push for meaningful reforms, not just for me, but for everyone affected by situations like this." Captain Reynolds looked surprised, but impressed. "That's commendable, Mr. Johnson. I'll personally ensure that your input is taken seriously. Rest assured, we'll do everything we can to prevent incidents like this from happening again." As Marcus left the station later that night, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: relief, anger, determination. They all swirled together, fueling his resolve to make a difference. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Pat sat alone in the break room, staring blankly at the wall. For the first time in years, she questioned whether she truly belonged in this line of work. The days following the incident were a whirlwind for both Marcus Johnson and Officer Patricia "Pat" Monroe. For Marcus, life seemed to move at two speeds. Publicly, he was thrust into the spotlight as news of the traffic stop spread like wildfire across social media platforms. The footage captured by bystanders painted a vivid picture of what had transpired. A well-dressed man being shoved against his car, cuffed, and detained, all while calmly insisting on his innocence. Hashtags like "Time Justice for Marcus" and the "China Accountability Now" began trending, with thousands of people chiming in to voice their outrage. Privately, however, Marcus grappled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he felt a deep sense of vindication knowing that his story had been verified, and that the truth was out there for everyone to see. On the other hand, the weight of the experience lingered, gnawing at him whenever he allowed himself to dwell on it. He couldn't shake the image of Pat's face during those tense moments, the mix of hostility and certainty in her eyes, as if she truly believed she was justified in treating him the way she did. It wasn't just about what happened to him. Personally, it was about the larger implications of systemic bias and how easily assumptions could spiral into harm. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Pat found herself caught in an entirely different kind of storm. Word of the incident spread quickly among her colleagues, dividing opinions within the department. Some officers rallied around her, dismissing the backlash as overblown outrage fueled by cancel culture. Others kept their distance, whispering behind closed doors about whether Pat had gone too far this time. Even her superiors seemed unsure of how to handle the situation. While no formal charges had been filed against her, Marcus had chosen not to press criminal charges. They knew they couldn't ignore the growing public scrutiny. Captain Reynolds called Pat into his office early one morning, his expression grim but professional. "Monroe," he began without preamble, "we need to address this head-on. Mr. Johnson has agreed not to pursue legal action, but he's made it clear that he expects accountability. More importantly, the community is watching us closely right now. We can't afford to let this slide." Pat clenched her jaw, staring at the floor. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the words stuck in her throat. Deep down, she knew Captain Reynolds was right. No matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise, the evidence pointed to one undeniable truth. She had acted rashly, letting her biases cloud her judgment. Still, admitting that aloud felt like swallowing shards of glass. "What do you want me to do?" Pat asked finally, her voice tight with frustration. Reynolds leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "You're going to sit down with Mr. Johnson, face to face. Mediation will be facilitated by our internal affairs team, but this isn't negotiable. If we want any chance of repairing trust, not just with him but with the public, we need to show that we're willing to listen and learn." Pat flinched visibly at the word learn, her pride bristling. But she nodded stiffly, knowing she didn't have a choice. As she left the captain's office, her mind raced with dread. What would Marcus say to her? Would he yell, mock her, demand her resignation? The thought of facing him again filled her with a mixture of shame and anger, a toxic cocktail she couldn't quite untangle. The mediation session took place in a small conference room at the precinct, its neutral tones doing little to ease the tension hanging in the air. Marcus arrived first, dressed in a simple yet polished button-down shirt and slacks. His demeanor was calm but deliberate, exuding the quiet confidence that came naturally to him. When Pat entered moments later, escorted by a representative from Internal Affairs, their eyes met briefly before both looked away. A mediator named Karen, a seasoned professional with years of experience in conflict resolution, greeted them warmly. "Thank you both for being here today," she said, gesturing for them to take seats across from each other at the table. "This meeting is meant to provide a safe space for open dialogue. My role is to guide the conversation, but ultimately, it's up to you two to decide how productive this session will be." Pat shifted uncomfortably in her chair, avoiding eye contact with Marcus. For his part, Marcus remained composed, though his gaze never wavered. Karen started by asking Marcus to share his perspective on the events leading up to the traffic stop. He spoke clearly and evenly, recounting every detail, from the moment Pat pulled him over to the aggressive escalation that followed. His tone was measured, devoid of malice, but the weight of his words hung heavy in the room. When it was Pat's turn to respond, she hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She began, her voice faltering. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I thought I was doing my job. I saw something that didn't add up and I acted on it. But I realize now that I let my assumptions get the better of me. And for that, I'm sorry." The apology was awkward and stilted, lacking the sincerity Marcus had hoped for. Still, he nodded slowly, acknowledging her effort. "Apologies are important," he said, his voice steady. "But actions speak louder than words. What happened that night wasn't just about me. It highlighted a much bigger problem, one that affects countless others who don't have the privilege or platform to fight back." Pat winced at the mention of privilege, her defenses rising instinctively. "You think I haven't faced challenges in my life?" she shot back, her tone sharper than intended. "You think I don't know what it's like to struggle?" Marcus held up a hand, cutting her off before things escalated. "That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that your struggles don't excuse the harm caused by your actions. You stopped me because of how I looked, where I was, and what I drove. That's not justice, that's profiling. And until we address that, nothing changes." The room fell silent, the gravity of Marcus's words sinking in. Pat stared at the table, her chest tightening with a mixture of guilt and defensiveness. She wanted to argue, to explain why she had reacted the way she did, but deep down she knew he was right. Her assumptions hadn't protected anyone. They had only perpetuated harm. Karen stepped in gently, steering the conversation toward solutions. "Officer Monroe, what steps are you willing to take to ensure something like this doesn't happen?" Again, Pat swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet Marcus's gaze. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said quietly. "Training, workshops, anything. I don't want to hurt anyone else the way I hurt you. Marcus studied her for a long moment, searching for sincerity in her expression. Finally, he nodded. Good. Because this isn't just about you and me. It's about creating real change. For everyone. By the end of the session, both parties left the room feeling drained but hopeful. For Pat, the road ahead was daunting. She knew rebuilding trust wouldn't happen overnight, and the journey would require humility, patience, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. For Marcus, the encounter served as a reminder of the power of grace and leadership. By choosing not to retaliate, he had opened the door for growth, not just for Pat, but for the entire department. As they parted ways, neither could have predicted the ripple effects their meeting would create. Little did they know, this single act of accountability would set the stage for broader reforms and perhaps even redemption. In the weeks following the mediation session, Officer Patricia Pat Monroe found herself in unfamiliar territory. For years, she had prided herself on being a by-the-book cop, someone who followed orders, trusted her instincts, and rarely questioned her own decisions. But now, doubt crept into every corner of her mind. The incident with Marcus Johnson had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself, her biases, and the system she served. It wasn't an easy pill to swallow. Her first step toward change came in the form of mandatory sensitivity training, a requirement imposed not just by her superiors, but also as part of the department's broader effort to address public concerns. At first, Pat approached these sessions with reluctance, convinced they were nothing more than a box-checking exercise designed to appease critics. She sat through lectures on implicit bias, cultural competency, and de-escalation tactics, often rolling her eyes or crossing her arms defensively. But over time, something shifted inside her. One particular session stood out. The instructor, a former police officer turned community advocate, shared stories from his own career, moments when he had let prejudice cloud his judgment and the lasting impact it had on those involved. He spoke candidly about the harm caused by assumptions, no matter how small or seemingly harmless they might seem at the time. We wear this badge because we want to protect people, he said, his voice firm yet compassionate. But sometimes, without realizing it, we become the very thing they're afraid of. Pat felt a lump rise in her throat. Those words hit too close to home. She thought back to that night on Maple Lane, the way she had looked at Marcus, judged him before giving him a chance to explain himself. Was she really so different from the officers in the instructor's stories? The realization stung, but it also lit a spark within her. Maybe there was still hope for redemption. Outside of the training sessions, Pat began volunteering with local organizations focused on improving police-community relations. One program, called Bridges Over Barriers, brought officers together with residents from underserved neighborhoods for open dialogues. These meetings weren't always comfortable. In fact, many were downright tense. But Pat attended them faithfully, determined to learn and grow. During one such meeting, a young woman named Tasha stood up to share her experience with law enforcement. Her voice trembled as she recounted the fear she felt every time she saw a patrol car drive by. "I know y'all are supposed to keep us safe," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "But sometimes it feels like you're here to punish us instead." Pat listened intently, her heart sinking as Tasha's words echoed in her mind. She had never considered what it must feel like to live under constant suspicion, to be treated as guilty until proven innocent, simply because of where you came from or how you looked. It was humbling and heartbreaking. After the meeting, Pat approached Tasha hesitantly, unsure of how she would react. "Thank you for sharing your story," Pat said softly. "I can't imagine what that must feel like, but I promise you, I'm trying to do better." Tasha studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Good," she replied. "Just remember, actions speak louder than words." While Pat worked to rebuild trust within the community, Marcus Johnson channeled his energy into advocating for systemic change. His position as Chief Operating Officer gave him unique leverage, and he wasted no time using it. He spearheaded initiatives aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within law enforcement agencies, pushing for reforms like mandatory body cameras, independent oversight boards, and stricter guidelines for use of force incidents. At the same time, Marcus remained actively involved in the partnership between his company and the police department. Rather than distancing himself after the incident, he leaned in, viewing it as an opportunity to drive meaningful progress. He collaborated closely with Captain Reynolds and other senior officials, offering insights and resources to support their efforts. Not everyone appreciated his involvement. Some of Pat's colleagues grumbled behind closed doors, accusing Marcus of grandstanding or holding the department hostage. Others dismissed his efforts as performative, claiming he was only doing it to boost his reputation. But Marcus didn't let the criticism deter him. He understood that real change required patience, persistence, and resilience. Despite their vastly different roles, Pat and Marcus crossed paths occasionally during this period. Their interactions were brief but significant. During one joint meeting with community leaders and police officials, Pat approached Marcus after the session ended. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said quietly, her voice tinged with sincerity, "for everything you're doing. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful." Marcus regarded her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You're welcome," he replied. "But remember, this isn't about me forgiving you. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what happened that night." Pat nodded, her expression softening. "I won't forget that." As months passed, the ripple effects of their encounter became increasingly evident. Public perception of the department began to shift, albeit gradually. Community members noted the increased presence of officers at local events, participating in activities like youth mentorship programs and neighborhood cleanups. Body camera footage from routine stops showed a marked improvement in communication and de-escalation techniques. Even social media posts criticizing the department grew fewer, replaced by cautious optimism. Still, challenges remained. Not all officers embraced the changes willingly, and some openly resisted them. Internal tensions simmered, threatening to undermine progress, but Pat refused to back down. She became an unlikely ally for reform, sharing her experiences with colleagues and encouraging them to join her in bridging divides. One evening, after a particularly tough day at work, Pat stopped by a community center where volunteers were hosting a free self-defense class for teenagers. As she watched the kids laugh and practice moves alongside officers, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. This was what policing should be about, not dominance or control, but connection and service. Standing in the doorway, she caught sight of Marcus chatting with a group of parents nearby. He glanced over and caught her eye, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. Pat returned the gesture, feeling a quiet sense of gratitude. Though their journey had started with conflict, it had evolved into something far greater, a shared commitment to creating a safer, fairer world. Neither of them knew what the future held, but one thing was certain. They had both been changed, forever. And perhaps, in their own small ways, they were helping to change the world around them too. Months turned into a year, and the ripple effects of that fateful night on Maple Lane continued to shape the lives of both Marcus Johnson and Officer Patricia Pat Monroe in ways neither could have predicted. The community, once fractured by mistrust and fear, began to heal, not perfectly but steadily. Progress was slow, uneven, and often messy, but it was progress nonetheless. And at the heart of it all were two individuals who had started as adversaries but ended up becoming unlikely catalysts for change. For Pat, the transformation wasn't easy. There were days when old habits threatened to resurface, moments when frustration got the better of her, or times when colleagues whispered criticisms behind her back. Some called her efforts soft, or accused her of bending over backward to appease critics. But Pat held firm, reminding herself of the lessons she'd learned, not just from Marcus, but from the countless stories shared by community members. During those open dialogues, her involvement with programs like Bridges Over Barriers deepened over time. What began as reluctant participation evolved into genuine passion. She found herself looking forward to the weekly meetings, eager to listen, learn, and contribute. One evening, while helping organize a neighborhood basketball tournament aimed at fostering connections between residents and officers, Pat realized something profound. Policing wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about building relationships. It was about being present, not as an authority figure, but as a human being. The kids at the tournament warmed up to her quickly, laughing as she awkwardly attempted free throws and cheering when she finally made one. A young boy named Jamal even handed her his worn-out sneakers after the game, insisting she keep them as a thank you. Pat chuckled, touched by the gesture, and promised to bring them back polished next week. These small victories may have seemed insignificant to some, but to Pat, they represented hope, a reminder that trust could be rebuilt, one interaction at a time. Word of her efforts spread beyond the precinct. Local newspapers featured her story in a series highlighting officers working to mend ties with the community. While some of her peers dismissed the coverage as overly sentimental, others took notice. Slowly but surely, more officers began joining, initiatives like the ones Pat championed. Even Captain Reynolds admitted he hadn't expected such dedication from her. "Monroe," he said one day, clapping her on the shoulder, "you're proving a lot of people wrong, including me." Pat smiled faintly, though inside she felt a swell of pride. She knew she still had much to learn, but for the first time in years she felt like she was making a real difference. On the other side of town, Marcus continued to wield his influence as chief operating officer to drive systemic change. His partnership with the police department expanded, incorporating new training modules focused on empathy, bias awareness, and conflict resolution. He also spearheaded a mentorship program, pairing corporate employees with at-risk youth, providing guidance and support to help them navigate challenges both personal and professional. But Marcus didn't stop there. Recognizing the power of storytelling, he collaborated with local filmmakers to produce a documentary chronicling the journey of reconciliation between law enforcement and the community. The film, titled Breaking Barriers, featured interviews with officers, residents, activists, and even Pat herself. When asked why she agreed to participate, Pat admitted candidly, "Because I want people to know that change is possible, if we're willing to face our mistakes and do the work." The premiere of Breaking Barriers drew hundreds of attendees, filling a downtown theater to capacity. As the credits rolled, applause erupted throughout the room, echoing long after the lights came back on. Marcus stood at the front, thanking everyone for their courage and commitment. Then, turning to Pat, who sat near the aisle, he extended a hand. "This wouldn't have been possible without you," he said simply. Pat hesitated for a moment before stepping forward to shake his hand. Her grip was firm, her smile sincere. For the first time since that chaotic night, she felt truly seen, not as the officer who had let bias cloud her judgment, but as someone capable of growth and redemption. Despite their shared accomplishments, the relationship between Marcus and Pat remained complicated. They weren't friends exactly, but they had developed a mutual respect rooted in understanding and accountability. Their paths crossed occasionally, at community events, strategy meetings, or chance encounters around town, but they rarely spoke at length. When they did, their conversations were brief yet meaningful, focusing on the ongoing work rather than past grievances. One crisp autumn afternoon, Marcus spotted Pat volunteering at a food drive organized by the department. She was stacking boxes of canned goods alongside a group of teenagers, her laughter mingling with theirs. He approached her hesitantly, unsure if he should interrupt. But Pat noticed him immediately and waved him over. "Hey," she said, brushing dust off her hands. "What brings you here?" Marcus shrugged, smiling. "Just checking in, making sure you're keeping your promise to stay involved." Pat chuckled, shaking her head. "You sound like my supervisor." "Well, maybe that's not a bad thing," Marcus replied lightly. After a pause, he added, "Seriously, though, thank you for everything. You've come a long way." Pat's expression softened, gratitude shining in her eyes. "So have you," she said quietly. "We both have." They stood there for a moment, surrounded by the hum of activity, sharing an unspoken acknowledgement. of how far they'd come and how much farther they still had to go. As winter approached, the community prepared for its annual Lights of Unity festival, a celebration symbolizing hope and resilience. This year, the event took on special significance as organizers dedicated it to the theme of healing together. Decorations adorned every street corner, and volunteers worked tirelessly to transform the park into a glowing wonderland of lanterns and fairy lights. On opening night, Marcus delivered a short speech to the gathered crowd. "Tonight," he began, his voice steady but warm, "we honor the strength it takes to confront our flaws, admit our mistakes, and work toward a better future. None of us are perfect, but together we can create something extraordinary, the Leor." Audience erupted into cheers, many holding candles aloft as a symbol of unity. Standing near the back of the crowd, Pat watched silently, her breath catching in her throat. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were getting closer to the world Marcus described. Later that evening, as fireworks lit up the sky, Pat lingered by the edge of the park, lost in thought. She thought about the road ahead, the challenges, the setbacks, the triumphs waiting to unfold. Then, glancing around at the smiling faces illuminated by bursts of color, she smiled too. Change wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't fast. But standing there, bathed in light and surrounded by hope, Pat knew one thing for certain: it was worth it.